that are popular among tourists and determines the best management policies. Scientist for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Coming from places like the National. Prior to her lab here, she was running. Anyways, so she got her undergrad at the University of Florida with a BA specializing in environmental policy, where she received as well as a member of the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. Between getting bachelor's and master's, she actually worked for it's a really cool program for, it's 2 years, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Where you teach at an under, like, from there, she actually got her master's from Oxford in environmental policy in the School of Geography. Adaptive management of natural resources and large-scale socio-ecological systems. Case study for Florida Everglades. And then she actually jumped straight into her PhD at MIT. And natural resource policy and planning. She was the winner of 2016's Best Doctoral Thesis, which was Community World in Ecological Institutional Analysis, Ecosystem Services. Southeast Asia, which was published. Her funding includes the Fulbright Scholar, Carol Wilson Fellow, the MIT Presidential. At the U.S. Department of State Critical Language Scholarship for Emerging. So some of her positions have included being a graduate researcher for MIT Science Impact Collaborative and the Woods Hole. Also an associate professor and lab director at Auburn. And during her time at Auburn, she was the director of the Conservation Governance Lab that received over 1.1.
Thank you. Thank you. Really quickly, by show of hands, is there anybody possibly interested in Teach for America? Maybe you're thinking about it, slightly interested, curious about it. Okay. Well, if you change your mind, we have a Teach for America representative for Wyoming and Colorado who can come out and say hello to you and kind of facilitate you. It's just a 2-year commitment. You get AmeriCorps, so you get federal preference on hiring for federal jobs, and it's like up to, it's a big number now. It's like up to $30,000 in loan forgiveness. So lots of benefits for you, but you're also serving your community, and you can be posted in an urban school. You can be posted in a rural school. It's really open to, you know, choose your own adventure. So if that becomes something that's interesting to you, I'll set up like a group info session with Teach for America. Today, I'm going to talk about a paper that we just published, and I did like a little short version of this link. So if you have to, like, you know, if you're one of my students and you must read a paper per day, I recommend reading this paper today because it's the one that I'm going to go over. So you have to do much less work reading it. So these used to be a lot nicer. But, you know, nowadays it's like you have to pay for the really nice ones. So shorturl.at/S9MRD, and you'll get to my former master's student Dan's paper, which constitutes the bulk of the talk that I'm going to do today. Okay. Thank you for that amazing introduction, Sophia. Kind of embarrassed, you know, I didn't want to go back to my undergrad days. But what I should say is, if any of that sounded like something that you would like to do, I'm the first of my entire family to go to school. I was raised by my grandparents in a pretty low income community in a trailer park. So if you also come from a trailer park and you think that you want to go to Oxford, MIT, you want to go do a critical language scholarship with the Department of State, you can. And I'm like a, you know, proof, if they gave it to me, they'll give it to you. Okay. So half the time with some of this stuff, like the Fulbright to Indonesia, Malaysia, you know, when I got that, they were like, nobody else applied. So half the time it's like these monies and these opportunities are left on the table. So, you know, foot on the gas, go for everything, go for money, go for travel opportunities, go for everything. Because like I said, if they gave it to me, they'll give it to you. Okay. So a lot of this work that I'm going to talk about today comes out of NCAR. What is NCAR? It's the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the Flatiron Mountains of Boulder, Colorado. The reason that I made a special slide for NCAR is because they have so many grants, scholarships, internships, opportunities for grad students. One of them is called like the GVP Bridge Program. One's called the Bridge Program. They change every year. The nature of the awards change every year, but I put that link up there for you so that if you want to spend a funded summer in Boulder, Colorado, where they pay you to hang out, you know, in this beautiful, does anybody know the architect of this building? I.M. Pei, he did like the crumble ball from Boston, the Guggenheim swirl. You know, the thing about I.M. Pei buildings is though they're very leaky, so it'll leak on your desk. But you get to work in that cool I.M. Pei building, amazing trails all around there, and you're working with the world's best atmospheric, oceanic, sort of like biophysical scientists. You can go work with them, and they're right here. They're not even that far away. So look into these programs. I'm happy, even if we don't know one another that well, I'm happy to recommend you for these programs because of my affiliation there. Just reach out to me. Happy to do it. And again, there's often not enough people who apply to these programs. So, you know. Okay, I'm not going to spend very much time on my intro. I have 2 books. They're at the library. If you think this research is cool, read these books for free, because ultimately, if you're a PhD student, if you're a very productive master's student, your work can turn into a book too. It's not, you know, mystical people out there that write books. It's you. It's the work that you're doing here. So read, and the best way to kind of get into the mindset of, hey, I want to turn my work into a book is just to read a book and kind of mimic the book, right? So see these in the library. These are some of the projects that I've done over the years. I wanted to talk quickly. Is anybody in here maybe thinking of working for an NGO, a nonprofit, that sort of thing? Not one person. Okay, yeah, some people. So this is the Rainforest Foundation. This was a quasi British government job and a quasi NGO job. These are indigenous communities of 5 countries of the Congo Basin. These pictures are from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We were talking about the way that local people kind of represent their natural resources and their fisheries and their wildlife so that we could use high precision GPS tools to make georeference maps that we would then go and, you know, do some lawfare in the government. Like we had lawyers that worked with us and they would sue the government because they would put these industrial logging and mining facilities right over tenured lands that these tribes had managed for over 5,000 years. So we were kind of, you know, doing the technical side of proving in court that the constitutional guarantees of tribal tenured land were not being met in the Congo. So if you're interested in that, you know, check out the work of the Rainforest Foundation. We also worked with WWF and Rainforest Foundation Norway. So if you want to kind of see the world, go work somewhere else, meet really cool people. Most of these people are still my friends. One really cool thing, I'm spending too much time on this. If you see this red line here, in the Congo, you really shouldn't portray rivers and streams as blue because that color means death. So if you're making a local map for local communities, you want to have the rivers and streams in red. So the map that we would bring to ministers in government would look the way that you would recognize a map, but the map that we would leave with the communities that we were working with always had the red rivers, streams, tributaries. So there were a bunch of little things like that. You know, cemeteries had to have a very particular look to them, but when you hear things about local ecological knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, this is what a career in that field could look like for you. Lots of listening, you know, lots of late nights up drinking beer and eating fish. It was the life, you know, but you grow out of it at one point because it's, you know, you want to be at home in your own bed. You don't want to be in Congo for 6 months. So do it while you can. I did a little coastal extension work with the University of Texas. This is another really cool opportunity that you could get into. Really great sort of master's degree level work. National Estuary Research Reserves, NERS. Really awesome opportunities to work. Like I would just drive this airboat around half the time, but the other half the time I was working with coastal decision makers, convincing people that were kind of skeptical about climate change to do things like buttress the pier that fishermen have used for hundreds of years in these little communities. So really kind of hardening the coasts against big hurricanes, but then also working with threatened and endangered species like the green turtle that we have here. Okay, but lots of jobs in the NERS. And if you ever see a job for a NER online and you would like to apply for it, or if you ever want to go to the Restoring America's Estuaries Conference, which has all these coastal professionals, please reach out to me because I would love to introduce you to people and make that happen. Okay, a little bit about my lab. The Wildlife Wilderness Recreation Lab goes all the way back to 2019 at Auburn. We focus on public policy, good use of public land, wildlife tourism, wildlife management, but the lab would not be what it is, without our students. Our students are really public service oriented people who go on to work in agencies and nonprofits. They go on to do AmeriCorps, maybe they've joined us from the military or the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps. Without our service oriented students, we wouldn't have the type of research that I'm going to present to you. One of my favorite students of all time, but all my students are my favorites. I wanted to talk to you quickly. You may have gotten a little abstract for this talk that was something along the lines of grizzly bears. And I'm sure that some people were like, I'm really looking forward to this grizzly bear talk, only to be bait and switched into a coral reef talk. So I wanted to give you the, the very micro version of the grizzly bear paper, which actually is Sophia's first author paper. Congratulations, Sophia. We took 2,000 quotations from stakeholders in Wyoming and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem focused on grizzly bears. 3,000 quotes that we pulled from people in the executive, legislative, and judicial kind of branches of our government. And we used what's called a structural topic model to pull out these threads of political discourse. And we kind of, made this amazing figure here. But, you know, we're just looking at how are people talking about the grizzly bear delisting issue? It's a very politically sensitive issue. And what are they saying? So this is kind of like the first analysis to really kind of break down like what different groups of political actors are saying about grizzly bears. Things like, oh, we should hand management over to the states, or, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty remaining in the science, so we can't possibly delist them from the Endangered Species Act. So these are the four main debates from our model. And then we also hand coded these things. So we even looked at the difference between, you know, using a model, using R, and using coding by hand. And then one thing I want to point out to you about grizzly bears that was surprising to us, and you know, we had a really great interdisciplinary team on this project with people with wildlife backgrounds. We had Temple, who is a lawyer, really just people from all these different interdisciplinary backgrounds, which is the best way that you can write a paper, is having this interdisciplinary team. One surprising thing out of a bunch of surprising things in a very long paper, people that are talking about the importance of delisting and handing over to the states. More of that conversation is coming from senators and congressmen than ever before, which to us is really quite surprising. Grizzly bear delisting comes from the executive branch, so agency staff, agency scientists. And, you know, there's some really great books and papers written about how the executive branch and the agencies, that's our primary science-making, science-focused arm of the government, but that's switching over time, and you have more of these other groups kind of throwing their hat in the mix. And what your task is as future conservation professionals or recreation professionals is being ready and able to deal with the fact that a lot more different types of political actors are involved. So that was the grizzly bear paper in 2 slides. But we're gonna get into a different paper. I know y'all are in Maggie's class, or you're kind of, maybe you've taken Maggie's class already, but I put a little bit of special attention here on the theoretical frameworks because that's such a big part of you developing your graduate projects. And that's really what kind of separates your graduate level work from undergraduate level work, is being able to talk in generalizable ways that you can kind of talk with other people from across disciplines. So kind of put a little bit more in that. But before I do, many of you know that scientists don't work alone. We work in a team. And these are all my collaborators from NCAR. But we also have Dr. Davidson here, who wrote some stuff about recreation for us. Oh, I had him twice on here. This is ridiculous. So what I want to emphasize to you is if you do some of these student programs, if you go to NCAR, you do the summer internship or you do the summer program, you meet a whole team of scientists and specialists that can lend added expertise to the work that you're doing here. Okay. So, shout out to the team. Can't do it without y'all. And actually this paper is a master's dissertation or a thesis. What do we call it? A dissertation? Okay, so this was Dan's master's thesis. So keep in mind as we walk through what this paper contains, this is someone's master's thesis, okay? Now, first, why do we care about coral reefs? Well, 25% of all species that live in the ocean can be found in a coral reef. And even though they have so many species, they only cover 1% of the seafloor. So the biodiversity is just incredible. It's hard to imagine how much biodiversity is on a reef. Who has been diving in the Caribbean, snorkeling or diving in the Caribbean? Who has been snorkeling or diving on the Great Barrier Reef or in the Pacific somewhere? Cool. So these are two different sets of reefs, right? Two different sets of species. You don't see, for example, clownfish in the Caribbean. So if you haven't been to the Caribbean or you haven't been to the Indo-Pacific, make sure to check all these reefs, all these types of reefs off your list while you still can, because they look very different depending on where you are. And it's just the coolest, most vibrant, colorful place to go, I think, on Earth. Tourism is a big part of the story. They are the poster child for nature-based tourism. They're also the poster child for climate vulnerability. Like they can only really exist between like 6 degrees of amenable temperatures, right? So if you fall outside of that really narrow range, you're gonna kill the reef, right? So we really got to care about these things from a climate perspective. People come from all over the world to dive, snorkel, fish. 70 million trips are made to reefs every year. $36 billion in tourism. $20 billion comes from snorkeling and diving alone. And people like the old timers in my family, we were commercial fishermen. So we were some of the first lobster fishermen in the South. And people talk a lot about producers in the West. That's the kind of producers that you have down on reefs. So livelihoods of all kinds, whether it's, fisheries or diving or tourism or really nice hotels, all sorts of cool stuff. But you also have a big cultural value, songs, art, time spent with loved ones, traditional cuisines. You can tie them all in with coral reefs. Has anybody ever had conch before? Like a conch fritter, conch salad? Very tasty. This is a conch. I make the best conch fritters. My family has a secret recipe going back 50 years. So I give it to you. It's not a real secret. It's just to get people like, oh, give me the recipe and then I will give it to you. Is anybody in here a Jimmy Buffett fan? Is that too dated? Most of Jimmy Buffett's band is named after the coral reefers. So, there's just a lot of cultural tie-in to reefs. We love them. We really value them. Like you can't walk into a grocery store where I'm from in South Florida without seeing like a mural of a reef. So very culturally important. And that's why we really care about them, but they also are big coastal protectors. So, we have the reef here. This is the 3rd largest barrier reef in the world behind the Great Barrier Reef. And then the Big Bank Reef off the coast of Belize. So we're number 3. Think of it like a big flood wall or like a big erosion wall. They're one of the most efficient blockages for hurricanes known to man. When a hurricane hits like this, and we had a bunch hit when I was a kid, and we had a bunch hit this past week. So we really want to keep these coastal systems in place, or else you see, folks like my family get hammered by these things. We got really hammered in Hurricane Andrew, which was probably before y'all were born. But, when you have these really healthy, vibrant systems here, and it's part of a wider tropical coastal seascape. So you have seagrass, mangroves, coral reefs. And when all those things are together, it's just so lovely. So if you get a chance to go down to the Florida Everglades, that's part 4 of that tropical coastal seascape into the marsh, and you have the cypress domes. It's so beautiful. You must go. Plan your trip now, spring break. Okay, so a healthy reef system does more to stop erosion, flooding, and storm surge from hurricanes than anything we could build. Like we could have a 30-foot flood or storm surge wall right there, and it still would not be as effective at wave attenuation and just calming down that very fast moving water, flooding, erosion than a naturally healthy reef. That's why they're so important to us. Now, threats to coral reefs. I have a confusing fact for you. Reefs are at the same time more threatened, but better protected than any point in their history. Now, I'm going to unpack that for you. Let's start with the threats. The threats, number one, climate change. The rapid rise in sea surface temperatures. We had the biggest marine heat wave on record last year. We're writing a paper about it right now in our lab. Absolutely catastrophic marine heat wave, unbelievable. Luckily, we were on the ground already for a pre-existing project, and we were able to kind of get some surveys and interviews done and figure out how people were just scrambling to deal with this sort of thing. But it is just it's out of control. And like I said, reefs can only survive between 73 degrees and 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything below that is too cold, so you won't see them there. That's why you don't see reefs off the coast of like the northern Gulf, like off the coast of Mississippi. Like the water's too turbid and it's just a bit too cold up there, up to 84. So once the water in late August, early September hits like, low 90s even, like you are just cooking these corals. And something happens to them here at the bottom. This is called coral bleaching. It's when coral reefs expel that symbiotic algae that lives in the living tissue on the outside. So the reason that they're like blue and green and yellow and pretty colors is because they have a symbiotic algae in the living tissue. And when they get really cooked in that hot water, they swell up and they expel that algae, which is bad because that's how they get their food. They eat their food with tentacles, but it's also produced kind of like a photosynthetic plant, and it like gives them sugars and stuff like that. So they starve, and their tissue is, they look in pain when you look at a reef. It's very sad. But it's part of the reason why we want to start working really seriously on climate. The second big threat is nutrient runoff from our sewage systems. This was a major cause of coral reef mortality when I was growing up. Just everybody had a septic tank and nobody got it pumped, so it just all went right onto the reef. People have really come around to that, but on the west coast of Florida, not so much. A lot of senior citizens on fixed income, so it's hard to completely overhaul your sewage system. And then finally, unsustainable fishing. This is a picture from where I did my doctoral fieldwork in Indonesia, Malaysia. Unsustainable fishing can mean like using a bomb. So like you take a little bottle and you put some bleach and some other chemicals in there. It costs like $0.25. And you shake it up, you throw it in the water, blows up like this, and it stuns all the big fin fish like grouper, snapper. They're tough to catch, but if you just put a bomb in the water and just, stun them all for a second, they just float to the top. I've been out with dynamite fishermen before. They float to the top, you skim them all off the top, you take them to the nearest market in Jakarta, and that's more cash, than most people see in a month. So unsustainable fishing, really big threat. But I also said that reefs are more protected than they have been at any point in human. You can make that claim globally, you can, but nowhere do people look after reefs more stringently than here and in the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. And we have a very quite complicated framework for the way that we look after our reefs, to the point where it's so complicated, nobody had written a paper on this until like 3 years ago when my grad student Kaysen did it. So here's what he found. Up here, polycentric, that means a bunch of NGOs are all in charge of different projects. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not related. Usually they're all working for some type of greater good, but ultimately you have a problem with kind of fragmentation. Then we have this huge federal sanctuary, Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. You should make a list of national marine sanctuaries and just tick them off. Go dive them all, snorkel them all, have fun in them all. They're crown jewels and they're underutilized because everybody's off at the national parks and everyone's forgetting the national marine sanctuary. So go make this one your first if you haven't been to one before. Then we have National Park Service here, like Biscayne Bay National Park, Dry Tortugas National Park. But then we also have State Park here. This is John Pennekamp State Park. This was maybe the first underwater park in the world. Now, you know how there's like the debate with Yellowstone. Was it really the first national park? It's this sort of semantics with this park too. But I say, hey, this was the first underwater park in the world. We have a duty to be, a model to other people looking after our reefs, and we pretty much are. And if you're interested in this sort of thing and how like people's movements and greater participation of stakeholders are good things for reefs here and in the wider Caribbean, That's what our most recent book is about. You can go look at it in the library. I think they have an e-version. Now, theoretical frameworks. I'm sure if you're like me, when I was a student, I found this stuff very hard. So I'm going to give you have all the governance, the state park managers, National Marine Fisheries. Now, how can you make sure that policy responses? So being able to try brand new things to deal with unprecedented marine heat waves is part of solving the problem. And we need to be able to do these things really quickly. Okay. Now, if you're prevented from doing that, you know, like the communities I was working in Indonesia, Malaysia, it was always financial. They didn't have enough money to do this sort of stuff. Here, this system is rolling in money, but what's kind of blocking us from responding is not enough space to grow nursery coral. And they need about 29 different permits to plant coral after a big event. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. What I want to talk to you also about are some innovative research methods. We've prototyped some research methods to look at collaboration and adaptive governance in my lab. We do this by taking this very quite complicated climate model called the Community Earth System 2 Large Ensemble Model. We have a very famous coral reef scientist, Joni Klipis, who she kind of discovered coral reef bleaching in the 70s. She won't admit that she's like that person, but she is. So we have all of her models. She's the best scientist. She's now retired. She's out of NCAR, but if you do one of these NCAR bridge programs, you'll probably work with Joni at some point. She's a genius, she's amazing. So we connect the Community Earth System 2 Large Ensemble Model with like things like temperature, storminess, ocean turbidity. We connect that with Joni's model that talks about coral bleaching, and we're able to kind of like predict the future of what the reefs will look like. And this is kind of like a little breakdown of what our research methods look like. So we have the climate model. We have Dr. Joni's coral bleaching model. So we translate the abiotic stuff into the ecology, right? Like how does a reef actually look during a marine heat wave like we saw last year? Then my student and I, Dan, we did all these qualitative interviews with coastal decision makers, but it was participatory research in the sense that we went to county commissioners, state managers, federal managers, nonprofit workers, and we were like, what do you want to know about the way that this system adapts to change, responds to change? What questions that you prioritize can we put in our interview manual so that you can use the findings and they can be helpful to you and they don't just, you know, sit in yet another academic paper, you know? And then we came up with this new framework for governance in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So these are the participatory methods that we've used in my lab. Anything from public meetings to we've done expert witness testimony in the Cayman Islands for some lawsuits about coral reef damage, radio appearances, testifying in court, really any way that you can get involved with decision makers. My lab has done it because our big priority here is just making sure that coastal decision makers, all decision makers, are able to use the research. Now, engaging stakeholders is important for two reasons. These outputs that we get from that NCAR model, the CESM2LE model, I can't even understand them, right? So we sit down with these climate scientists and we say, what does this actually look like? You know, you're giving me this confidence interval, you're giving me this quantitative output, you're giving me this very technical output. I've taken classes in this stuff and it's hard for me to follow, right? So what we want to do is we want to put it in easy to follow, accessible information. And we refer to these types of accessible stories as scenarios. So before we go and sit down and have an interview with the Sanctuary Advisory Council or other state and federal managers, this is what we do. We go from like a complicated regression output or, just a very complex confidence interval to this. By the year 2032, there's going to be persistent coral bleaching at least once a year. Corals will be broken or diseased, and they will be noticeably less colorful. Key species that use the reef as a home, like lobster, snapper, grouper, will be less present. Even with this scenario, it's possible that some corals will be more heat tolerant, and those may be the ones you will start seeing more frequently. Now, we didn't just want to read this scenario out in our interviews or surveys, or have the respondent read. We also wanted to give them pictures. So this is the short-term scenario. Now we also have the long-term scenario. And again, this is all based on the outputs of that NCAR climate model. So it's based on the best available science, right? And I will tell you, Monroe County, where we did a lot of this research, not climate change friendly folks for the most part. They want to hear about climate, they don't. But they do want to hear about environmental change. And just changing that one word gets you so much better data and connections with people. I don't care. Like, I'll change it. I have no pride. If you want to talk to me about how you and your family are adapting on the reef, I will swallow my pride and say environmental change. I don't care. But sometimes you just need to adapt to the community that you're in, and to get better data off people. We notice we talked to a lot of commercial lobster fishermen, English as a second language, didn't have a lot of schooling. The pictures were the best thing. They were like, this one's already happening. Your model is off. So that was one of our main findings, was that our model was too conservative, even though, climate scientists get told all the time that we're too, we're too doom casting, not enough doom casting actually. So, okay, this is what we found in one picture. The best findings for research should be able to be translated into a picture. If you turn your findings into a picture, you need to sit down, think about it more, go on a little walk, have a coffee. The minute you can turn your findings into a picture, that's almost like your outline for your thesis. Picture, write about what's in the picture, you're done with your thesis, you have your master's. Okay, so this is what we found. First, because storminess had increased so much in the months of June and July, these are peak tourist season. The water is much more turbid during these periods. So people who would run diving and snorkeling tours have started to say, the weather's too weird during peak tourism months. I make more money switching over to being an Uber driver. We can't even bring people snorkeling in June, and more it's becoming that way in July as well. These are peak season. People make their whole revenue for the whole of the year during June, July. And now people are saying we can't even bring people out on the reef. The water's too turbid. The other thing that we found, commercial fisheries that have been in this state, in this region for 200 years are moving north. So I live like up here. Well, I grew up here. All of the commercial fishermen that I talked to, lobster, finfish, they were like, we're fishing where you're from. We're not fishing down on the Keys anymore. So they're literally having to push northward. And then I'll talk a little bit about the experimental policy responses, the nurseries, selecting corals based on genotypes that are more resistant to disease and heat, and replanting. So this is what we found, our most important findings. So if this paper is on your to-read list, you don't even need to read the paper. It's all right here in this slide. I did want to just kind of hammer this home. Is anybody, who's had Maine lobster from Maine? Who's had spiny lobster in Florida and the Caribbean? Not one person. Okay, your homework is to find some time to go to the Florida Keys. This is the superior lobster. I say this as like a descendant of commercial lobstermen, but please, this is the superior lobster. It's so tasty. You can go and get one at Publix. It's better if you cook it yourself at home. So, and the difference is, as you can tell, no big claw, right? So when we're talking Florida spiny lobster, when you go lobster fishing, you're just after that tail. So we don't have the big claw like Maine lobster. When I titled this talk, When the Lobsters March North, it's because of that striking interview that I took with that commercial fisherman. He's a 75-year-old old timer. He had been fishing. He made it a point to tell me that he had been fishing longer than I had been alive. And what he told me was, we are now fishing not only where you're from up here, but we will run boats all the way up to Georgia waters now. And we never did that even 10 years ago. So really surprising interview with him. And he inspired the title of the talk. And as you could tell from Sophia's intro, I'm not good at titles. I think this is my first time with a good title. Okay, so one last thing about frameworks, you're gonna have your data, you're gonna get your data, even the most well-crafted frameworks, you're gonna find out in some places that you call it something different, and that's like your thing that you did. It feels quite small, like get used to it. That's our world, little tiny incremental. So because of the input from my work is collaborative adaptive environmental governance, and the way that we changed it, dialogue between stakeholders, inclusion, experimental policy responses, and third thing over here, if I have collaborative participatory research, because you really can't understand what's going on. Involvement in your research of the studying, but you're not studying them, you're studying the system. Closely hand in hand with these folks. You can, but you can't do it in the way that I think is going to be impactful. And I think ultimately at the Help School, that's why we come here, is to be impactful. Really quickly, I want to talk about these experimental policy responses because they're so cool. My students and I got to work on these. We got to work on these Christmas tree things. Elkhorn and Staghorn coral. You can tell that they're different designs. The nursery where they select on genotype. Select on genotype. So they have found certain are more resilient to that disease, so they're selecting those, they're outplanting those, they're also tolerant corals. So the good thing about a horrible marine heat wave is they got them to say what lived, and then they bring they'll put them in petri dishes. There's some really cool policy responses. You literally do need like 29 different permits, federal and state, to do this type of work. So that's the big block here, is just regulatory confusion. Hey, I did have it. Okay, so this is our this is our revised series, collaborative adaptive governance. We put dialogue and inclusion of stakeholders on the same one because when you're in the field asking those questions, found writing the blueprint management plan for the sanctuary. So some of our recreational fishing stakeholders got to have direct relationships with people revising the management plan because of the design of the research. So, but you see how you start with a framework and then you collect your data and then you kind of adjust it based on what you're doing. Great. Okay, so what is next? We got an NSF. We're going to be doing the same stuff with trout. We're going to be picking some really cool and important watersheds in Colorado and Wyoming, maybe working on the Wind River Reservation, maybe working on the White River National Forest where a former student of mine works. This is the design of that project, kind of more relevant to us. We have hydrology changes, snowpack and precipitation, stream flow. We have a modeler at Auburn that's going to look at like hybridization. So like, rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, bow trout, like what is the distribution of native and introduced or stocked species going to look like given these environmental changes? We're about to start 2 years worth of interviewing people who run tours for fishing, guides, outfitters, but also managers. So it's going to take on the same design where we'll work with people in the national forest, we'll work with people in state government, federal and state agencies to say, what are you curious about the future of, distribution and abundance of these rec fish species? And then we're going to kind of revise these same collaborative adaptive governance frameworks that you saw. Here's our little slide of references. And here's my contact, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
So they can hear
So you turn those microphones on.
Yeah.
This is why you can't hear the audience in my Zoom recordings.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day. All right, who has a question? What is your name and who are you working with and what are you studying?
My name is Paisley. I'm a TA and I'm still working out exactly what I'm studying. But I'm curious about individual and community values and how they relate to environmental issues. But my question was maybe more about your findings. So you discussed the lobsters marching north. I don't know anything about coral reefs, but are you noticing that they're transitioning further north as well?
It's a really good question. Coral reefs operate on a geological time scale. So like that'll probably happen in 10,000 years, right? But the other thing that needs to be absolutely perfect for a coral reef to be somewhere, they're like the most miraculous ecosystems because you need this big water filtration system right here in Everglades National Park. So you need very low nutrients, super clear, clean water of that small temperature range. These are very low nutrient systems. So you don't see reefs like this in Apalachicola, near Pensacola. You don't see them like in Mobile Bay, stuff like that, because the water is not clear enough for them to be there. So they need the perfect combination of very clear water, maybe cleaned by one of the biggest marshes in the world, so you'll need some more things to kind of be in place, but we are seeing what you're talking about. It's called tropicalization of very warm weather loving trees. Red mangrove specifically are the ones at the prop root. So we're seeing those up like near Cape Canaveral on the Space Coast, and they were never there when I was a kid. We're seeing them in Texas. We're seeing them in the North Gulf. When we have a big frost event, like in Texas or in Mobile Bay, they'll die back, but we are seeing them there more and more. Thank you. Steely.
So how does the protection of coral reefs differ in other areas compared to like the United States and how we protect our coral reefs?
Really good question. Our lab wrote a book on this, if any of you are interested in this question. So this book was the first book to talk about that. And we looked at top-down sort of federal national parks versus bottom-up, community-based, village-based, co-managed parks. And we collected ecological data, so we were diving all the time and looking at how healthy the reefs were. And we also collected socioeconomic data from coastal fishermen and people who manage the marine protected areas. And what we found were kind of generalizable findings from other areas. So like in very low resourced communities like Sulawesi in Indonesia, we had these amazing networks of marine protected areas, but there was no enforcement. They were paper parks on the water. But where you had these community-based co-managed parks, people really felt kind of like included, even if they weren't paid to really look after the reef. It was their home, it was their source of livelihoods. So there was a lot more buy-in for reef management. You know, everything being the same, in low resource communities, the bottom-up styles of coral reef protection were much more effective because people felt like it was their thing to protect. The Great Barrier Reef is probably the most famous example. That's like a federal marine park. But they pioneered very early on, like in the early 90s, like multi-stakeholder processes where they brought farmers in, because a bunch of what they deal with is like runoff from the farms. And we don't have all that runoff from the farms because the Everglades cleans it, but they don't have a big Everglades looking after their reef. So they brought in like multi-stakeholder groups, like big shipping and big ag, negotiated an outcome for management there. Hey, Abdul.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm just wondering which factors of climate change is more impactful on coral reef, and how multi-stakeholder engagement is ensured for its protection. Thank you.
So the most important drivers of change on coral reef, sea surface temperature, that's the biggest one. The next one is storminess, because with the storm you have turbidity. So when you have the water quality that's just completely cloudy, you can't have the sun get through to the reef organism, and it has that photosynthetic algae that lives in its skin. So when you have a lot of turbidity, like in the New York Times for the past 10 years, you saw all this stuff about the Port of Miami dredging and how it was like a violation of the Endangered Species Act. What they were talking about there was the Army Corps of Engineers was deepening the channel, and they were dredging, and all this turbidity was in the water. So the reefs in the national park were dying from that. So the next climate related thing would be storminess, because of the links to turbidity. So sea surface temperatures followed by storminess. But then also precipitation, like if you're looking in the Australian setting where they have all these big farms that they have to deal with the runoff, if you have more frequent and more intense storms, you have more runoff and more phosphorus in the water. And these are low nutrient systems. The other thing that happens when you have excess nutrients are big fleshy algae grows on the skin, and it also blocks them from photosynthesis. And then the question about multi-stakeholder arrangements, what was the end of that question?
How multi-stakeholder engagement is ensured for that,
For those drivers?
Yes.
Well, I think that that's, the charge of your generation, right? Like there isn't. I mean, if you had to ask me how to rapidly decarbonize in a way that would protect reefs from vanishing off the face of the earth, I mean, it's the usual suspects. Like for me, in particular, I would love to see nuclear power and like rewiring the grid on nuclear power, everybody driving, electric vehicles when they can. And, but this is the big problem, right? And this is a lot of what we found in this particular book was some of the best community-based coral reef management groups in Southeast Asia are really angry in some of those interviews, because they're like, we have nurseries here, we have no money, and we found ways to do all this stuff. We're replanting, we're harvesting invasive species off our reef, we're doing everything right. And it's you in the West, in the global North, that are creating all these impacts that we can't possibly adapt to. So to answer that question, that type of multi-stakeholder stuff is not happening, and we ought to.
Yeah, thank you.
But that's what you have to do with the UN for us, Abdul.
We'll do one more and then we should probably.
So you talked about,
Oh, can you tell me your name and your
Oh, yeah.
where you're studying?
my name is Jonathan. I'm kind of figuring out what I'm going to be doing my thesis or plan B on, but Kurt Davidson is my advisor and I TA for him as well. So my question is, you talk a lot about how the Everglades are the big filtration system, and obviously that's the southwest part of Florida. You say that the lobsters are moving north along the Atlantic coast. As they get further away from the Everglades, are there any new threats that you think will be posed to the lobster population?
This is something that the fishermen were obsessed with. Whenever we were doing like, what questions do you want? This was their question. And I was like, I can't go and sample lobsters for y'all, but like I can connect you with people who are sampling lobsters, but it's an open question. The lobster, the stony lobster, they live all the way up to say like where Lake Okeechobee is, like that latitude. But once you start getting into those more turbid waters and you have like the marsh up into Jacksonville, I mean, they don't live past a certain point. Like they need that clear water, they need that perfect temperature range for them because they are a subtropical species. But this is like hot topic item. You want to go and figure some of these questions out with commercial fishermen, there's appetite. Cool, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to the online people. I'll say goodbye. Leave it.